Yo, what up, and welcome back to Pnoid News. Man, listen, all right, I got an economics thing for y'all today. I just finished a book called Angrynomics by Mark Blythe and Eric Longiger. And I want to react to about a chapter of this book. It's going to take a little bit, so it's going to be a bit of a long one if y'all want to sit back, relax, and, you know what I'm saying, listen to something interesting. I got a couple of little charts to pull up or whatever to prove some of my points. And, you know, we'll get into this, you know what I'm saying, and have more of a discussion on this at some point in the near future. But in the meantime, yeah, let's, let's stand here and, hear exactly what these individuals had to say, because I think it's kind of important because Mark's an economic historian, and Mark is, economic, he's a market guy, you know what I mean? And both of them are capitalists, and so this isn't about communism or anything of the sort. But, I think some of Mark's solutions are far too communistic as far as I'm concerned. But, it's all up into the eye of the beholder, the eye of the beer holder, as it were. So, let's get into this and listen up a little bit.
Capitalism is hardware with crashes and resets. We praise a man who feels anger on the right grounds and against the right people. Aristotle. The parable of the three economists. Karl was, if truth be told, more of a historian than an economist. Indeed, deep down inside, he thought that the whole turn of the world in the 19th century to market exchange, wage labour, and making everything into a commodity for sale for the sake of profit was a thoroughly bad idea. His hunch was that labour was unique among commodities, in that it was not really a commodity at all. Labour was, after all, like Soylent Green, made of people. And while Soylent Green cares not a jot what it costs, people do. And if the world around them changes in such a way as to make them poorer through no fault of their own, they will get very angry and demand that the state protect them against these market forces. People laughed at Karl. They assured him that markets were as natural as the air we breathe and provided, as Dr. Pangloss promised, the best of all possible worlds. And then the world collapsed in the 1930s, and people everywhere rebelled against markets. John was, if truth be told, more a mathematician and a philosopher than an economist, but perhaps that's why he could discern another truth. That supply does not create its own demand, because individuals' decisions to consume and save and invest are separate from each other in time. Once you realize this, recessions and depressions suddenly make sense. If investors get depressed about the future, they will not invest now, which brings about the very outcome they are trying to avoid in the future, a recession. John thought he had found the answer to curing depressions. It's simple, really. If your expectations of the future are depressed, all you have to do was spend some cash today to raise the level of prices tomorrow, and investors would start investing again today, anticipating profits ahead. The point of spending was not spending. It was to shift expectations of future profits. But when John's ideas became popular, Mikhail, who came from the same part of the world as Karl, found a flaw in John's logic that echoes Karl's hunch about labour. If John's solution was to raise prices to prevent recessions, Mikhail figured out that doing so would result in a shift in power from business to labour. Specifically, if full employment were guaranteed, labour could move costlessly from job to job, all the while bidding up the wage they receive in permanently tight labour markets. This would cause businesses' profits to fall, labour's share of national income to grow, and diminish the political clout of the investor class. Mikhail mused that the inevitable result would be a revolt by capital against labour and a reinstatement of market discipline. After all, if Karl was right and labour facing wage cuts would turn against markets and turn to the state for protection, all business needed to do was take over the state and roll back those protections to restore their place at the top of the table. So the project became to reverse Karl's protectionist impulse, which is oddly exactly what happened in the 1970s and 1980s. What then is the point of this parable? It tells us that at the end of the day, you may have the perfect technical answer to an economic question, But if the politics are against you, you're done.
Okay, so basically, those three parables and whatnot, you know what I mean? One, you know what I'm saying, was a guy named Carl in the 40s, believe it or not. The second one was John Maynard Keynes, and the third one was this French guy who came up with this ideological theory, right, in the 1940s about what would happen in the 1970s. And this mentality, right, which will be broken down further, but I'll be honest with you, I kind of want to break this up and put some of my own commentary in here, just because, you know, I don't want it to be seen as I'm just standing here stealing, you know what I mean, their work or whatever. You know, it's important to understand that the part that democracy and government does play in the economy, because ultimately labor, you know what I'm saying, which is the part, you know what I mean, of the economy, which is made up of the people who vote. You know what I mean? At the end of the day. And there's only so much they can do, especially today with, you know what I'm saying, the democratization that the internet has brought to the entire spectrum to continue to control the narrative the way they did back during the times of Reagan or, you know what I mean, things of this nature. So let's keep rocking though.
Mark, we have outlined two forms of public anger. One form, the most pernicious and virulent.
Oh, by the way, the guy talking is the guy on the right, and the guy about to talk is the guy on the left. Just want to put that out there.
Is the energy of tribes. It has been exploited by segments of the political classes and the media to motivate a minority that is angry and tribal. It polarizes and it threatens violence and discrimination. Angry minorities can and do win close elections. The second form of public anger, which we need to listen to and address, is moral outrage. People have been neglected, ignored, disparaged, and the political classes have failed to listen to their genuine concerns: job insecurity, a loss of skills, rapid changes in working practices, a loss of representation, wealth inequality more extreme than anything we've seen since the Roaring Twenties, political corruption, and a discredited elite. This is political anger as a form of legitimate moral rebuke. It has economic origins, but it has a history and a backstory. Let's try and piece together that story as best we can.
Okay, let's use an analogy we've used before when trying to get people's heads around the long-run story of Angrynomics.
This is important, so pay attention, y'all.
It's an analogy of capitalism being like a computer that crashes from time to time. This provides a simple model for thinking about the macro story behind Angrynomics. Let's walk through three versions of this capitalism/computer analogy that we can call versions 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0. Now, with that as a preamble, let's get started.
Before discussing each of the versions, let me talk about the hardware of capitalism. Imagine your tablet or laptop is a capitalist economy. That is, an economy where the production of goods and services is provided by individuals and firms through markets, where who gets what is rationed by prices and incomes. If you drop the laptop on the floor and picked up the pieces, you will find the hardware that makes it work. If your laptop or tablet is an Apple product, it will be configured. The bits fit together in a certain way. That configuration will differ from, say, a PC laptop or a Samsung tablet. They each have essentially the same components, but the plumbing of how they fit together is different. Now go back to a real economy we live and work in. Just as every computer has a motherboard, a memory, a video processor, and a central processor, so every capitalist economy has a labor market, a capital market, a government, and a host of other similar component parts. And just as Apple and Samsung products are configured differently, so is the arrangement of the components that make up real economies. Imagine, for comparison, the US and German economies. The US labor market is lightly regulated, produces large numbers of workers with general skills. Training is done by institutions external to the labor market itself, such as colleges and universities. In contrast, in Germany, the labor market is much more regulated. It produces much more highly skilled workers, and many of those skills are produced by training within labor market institutions, such as trade unions and firms. Now think about stock markets. The US stock market is huge, deep, liquid, and the goal of many companies is to get listed on the market and for the founders to cash out as quickly as possible. The hardware of the German economy is dominated by a network of typically small and medium-sized, often family-run businesses. Typically, they never bother to list or issue shares. The same contrast exists between the US and German governments. They are both federal states, but one taxes and redistributes large portions of national income, and the other one does not, comparatively speaking. The take-home on all of this is that, like computer hardware, the way that capitalist institutions quite literally fit together limits the type of policies that can be produced. If you have deep, liquid and open equity markets, you can get the most out of your population to buy into equity-based private pensions. If you don't, you can't. If you have large trade unions that control skills development, you don't move production to Mexico or China quite as quickly, since you will not be able easily to find the skills you need. Okay, so that's the hardware, but what about the software? That is, the ideas we have about how economies can and should work that gives us the code for running the hardware.
Just as the configuration of the hardware limits what outcomes the machine can produce, so it also limits the type of ideas, the software, that can be run on the machine. For example, given German institutions, it would be next to impossible to run radical libertarian software on the German economy. Likewise, given US institutions, running the software for, say, Swedish social democracy is likely to raise severe incompatibility issues. Just as software and hardware must be aligned on a laptop or a tablet, you can't run Apple's operating system on a Samsung tablet without a lot of editing of the software. So they must be aligned if capitalist economies are to function. Moreover, given that different hardware and software configurations have emerged over time in different places, it should not be a surprise that what Denmark produces, consumes and values should be different from what China produces, consumes and values. Now, with all that in our heads, we can map how different economies, different combinations of software and hardware, have emerged over time, and how they periodically produce a lot of anger. The key here is recognizing how bugs arise in the software that eventually crash the machine. When that happens, just like a computer, capitalism crashes and needs a system reset. The hardware needs to be reconfigured and the software needs to be rewritten. And sometimes it is. And it's usually a painful process. These crashes are the periods that generate lots of anger. To see why, let's go back to our opening parable. The Karl in our opening parable is not Karl Marx, as you may have thought. Rather, it was Karl Polanyi, a historian and sociologist. Polanyi wrote a book in 1944 called The Great Transformation that captured the essence of the bug in the software that killed version 1.0 of liberal capitalism, the version that emerged in the 19th century, spanned the globe by the turn of that century, and crashed and burned in the aftermath of the First World War. To find that bug, Polanyi asked the following question. Markets, trading and prices have existed for as long as humans have been around. So what is it that makes economic organization capitalist? Polanyi argued that what made capitalism distinct from previous modes of economic organization was that it rested upon the deliberate construction by the state of three fictitious commodities, labor, land and capital, without which you can have markets and exchange, but you can't have capitalism. The most important fiction, as the parable explains, is that labor is a commodity. That is, a sack of potatoes, or a ton of wheat, or Soylent Green, is manifestly a commodity and doesn't care what it costs. But labor surely does. It likes it when its price, wages, goes up and hates it when it goes down. When you continually push wages down under a deflationary gold standard in the 1920s, or under the countries must be more competitive with each other dogma in the Eurozone in the past decade, you end up creating a great deal of uncertainty and hardship for the people involved. People hate that stuff and get angry about it. Labour is the only commodity capable of generating a social reaction to movements in its price, which is why the notion that labour is a commodity like any other is a fiction, or at least a well-maintained political and legal construct necessary for capitalism to function.
All right, so I want to push back a little bit against that, but not a lot. Now, the idea that labor is a commodity is absolutely true because, the labor market needs a certain number of individuals in order to do things, right? And in order for those individuals to be able to buy things inside of this economy as a whole, you have to make a certain amount of money in order to live. Now, this is an important thing to understand as far as things are concerned, right? Because as far as economies are concerned, really what it is made of an economy is basically just what human beings value, right? That's really what economy is about. It's about, it's the measure of what individuals value and what they're willing to trade their value, their valuable objects for, whatever it is, whether it's money, whether it's gold, whether it's silver, whether it's, corn or tobacco, or whether it's squirrels trading acorns. That's just really what is the value, what do you value inside of your society or your group or culture, whatever it is, right? So, that's why it is that, that's what an economy is as a whole. And in order to produce the things, for us to buy, or in order for individuals in this economy as a whole, the way our economy works, individuals have to be able to gain monetary value to be able to trade for those goods. And so with that being said, there's only a certain number of individuals inside of an economy that's going to tolerate before wages drop. There's also, you know what I'm saying, a certain number of individuals that have to be there in order to maintain, wage stability as far as things are concerned, right? So that's kind of where an economy is as a whole, right? So it's important to understand that labor is a commodity, but it's not at the same point. Like, individuals want to be able to make as much money as possible, but on the same point, they don't want to be devalued to the point of where they're no longer valued enough that they can survive inside of their economy where they are, which is what, basically is a recession or a depression. So let's rock.
Polanyi's insight boils down to this simple point. The more that you try to treat wages as a price, as just another cost to minimize, the greater the social reaction against market exchange it provokes. If the version of capitalism you happen to inhabit has very few safety nets, and market relationships are the only ones that you can access to survive, there will be a demand by the citizenry for protection from the ups and downs of the market itself. Polanyi called this the double movement. That is, any attempt to create a society dependent upon markets that treats labour like a commodity will inevitably produce a backlash against those policies, precisely because labour is not a commodity like any other. That backlash will take the form of demands for protection from the market. That protection, in turn, can take the form of trade unions. It can also take the form of Joseph Chamberlain's social imperialism. It can take the form of New Deal liberalism or Italian and German fascism. Today it takes the form of an economic nationalism that, in the words of Brexiteers, seeks to take back control and make the economy more responsive to politics. In short, if you want to understand what's happened in the 1920s and 1930s when capitalism version 1.0 crashed, it's really a story about the attempt to sustain the economic fiction of labour as a commodity, coming up against the political reality, which is that if you treat people like a sack of potatoes, they end up throwing the system into the fryer.
Now, if Polanyi gives us the first piece of the puzzle regarding where today's Angrynomics comes from the fiction that labour is just another commodity, which is politically unsustainable in practice, then the second piece of the puzzle comes from our friend John in our opening parable. John is, of course, John Maynard Keynes, who wrote a book in 1936 that was also a reflection on the failure of capitalism version 1.0, called The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. Prior to Keynes, economists thought that left on their own, markets clear. Buyers find sellers and workers find employment. And through free competition, full employment would be produced. Keynes argued against this view, drawing on his understanding of the then ongoing Great Depression, arguing that most of the time we don't actually inhabit a world where markets always clear and the poorest improve along with the richest. Instead, the world produced by capitalism can be one of high unemployment or even a full-blown depression and great inequality. There is no natural tendency for the system to attain the best of all possible worlds. Given this, Keynes comes back to the role of the state, as does Polanyi, but from a different angle. Keynes wants the state not just to act as a law-setting institution that creates Polanyi's fictions that make markets possible. He wants the state to counteract emotional swings in private sector spending that cause depressions by using public expenditure to stabilize employment and investment. Now, what does all that mean in the real world, and how does it relate to Polanyi? It means that in the period from 1870 to 1930, during capitalism version 1.0, states could allow millions of workers to become unemployed and just say, this is the natural order of things, because there was no alternative software, ideas, to run on the existing hardware, institutions. Indeed, the main safety valve of the period was immigration from countries with excess labour to countries with too little labour. Hence Ellis Island and the rise of the United States. But at its core, the software running on version 1.0 said that any attempt by states to do anything about bad market outcomes, such as unemployment or poverty, would be counterproductive, as the market would in the long run sort itself out. But when the multifaceted cataclysm that was the 1930s occurred, the effects of pent-up First World War inflation on savings, the failed attempt to restore the gold standard, the Wall Street crash, the collapse of global trade, all of which compounded the pressures on labour, version 1.0 collapsed. As Keynes famously said, it turns out that in the long run, we are all dead. And the death of version 1.0 produced three distinct expressions of public anger. The first one was fascism. Fascism was an attempt by the state to save the market by abolishing society. It is totalitarian in that the fascist solution to anger is for everyone to be disciplined by the state, so that tribal anger is displaced onto the foreign and the impure. The second one was communism, which is an attempt to use the state to abolish the market, thereby disciplining society through class homogenization and the forced elimination of inequality to produce model subjects. The last one is the most adaptive, a combination of democracy and markets, because in a democracy you get the vote, which gives legitimate voice to anger. But the problem with giving a voice to anger is that in version 1.0, what matters is money, not voice, while what matters in a democracy is votes. These two currents rather obviously come into tension. Capitalism version 2.0, if it was to survive, had to resolve that tension by making democracy and markets work together rather than undermine each other.
This brings us nicely to the content of Keynes' 1936 book, which was the new software written to make democracy and markets work together in Capitalism version 2.0.
Which, by the way, y'all should read it. You know what I'm saying? Like, legit, you should read Keynes. It's a very easy read, right? It's not like Adam Smith, right? You know what I mean? It's legit. Like, it's not anywhere near as bad as, like it's much more accessible as far as things are concerned, right? But, you know, that's kind of, you know, I just wanted to put that out there. It's important that you read the literature about what we're talking about as a whole, you know, because it's kind of an important thing.
The system that ran from 1945 to 1975. To clarify how different these two software programs were, consider the two simplest ways we could write down the software for version 1.0 and then the software for 2.0. The software for version 1.0 is often called the quantity theory of money, but here we will take it as the basic software rule for running capitalism version 1.0. MV equals PQ. M equals money. V equals its velocity, how rapidly it's spent in the economy. P equals prices. Q equals quantity, all the stuff in the economy. So money times its velocity of circulation must equal quantity, all the stuff in the economy, and the prices that denominate them. Easy. What we have here is a very simple model of the world, where on the left-hand side we have the monetary side of the economy, money times its velocity, how fast it's spent, basically, equal to the real side of the economy, the quantity of all the stuff produced, Q, times the prices that we pay for it, P. Now here's the trick. MV equals PQ is a truism. It's true by definition. But if I assume that over the long run, or in the absence of state interference, market imperfections and or Martian invasions, that velocity, V, is stable, I can make some powerful claims. For example, that if you increase M faster than Q, it will show up in an increase in P, inflation. And if M drops precipitously, then P will do the same, deflation.
So basically, if you add more money, you'll end up with higher prices, i.e. inflation. It's important, you know what I mean, that we break that down so everybody understands it, you know what I mean, as a whole.
In this model, Q, which is the total of economic output generated in free markets by capital and labour, should be left to its own devices. The state should limit itself to carefully controlling M, which generates inflation. So there is a definite politics here. In version 1.0, money is kept in an anti-democratic box, away from meddlers and popular demands, and in return the owners of capital and the investor class, those at the helm of the growth machine, give us ever-rising standards of living. Given the way the software was meant to run, the Great Depression came as quite a shock, since it seemed that the only explanation for the mass unemployment of the period was that millions of people randomly went on unpaid leave for years, and the desire to invest left the investor class. Clearly the software rule was bust. But what was the alternative? This is Keynes' alternative software rule. Y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. In this world, money disappears and the state comes back in. Y equals total income of everyone in an economy. C equals total consumption. I equals total investment. G equals government expenditure. X minus M, in brackets, equals net exports. Placed in brackets because in the context of the 1930s and the post-war 1940s, the economy was largely insulated from outside forces. Keynes' trick was to admit fully that I, investment, was the most important part of the equation, and to agree with the version 1.0 view that without investment, I, there can be no wage growth, no productivity increases, nothing. But, he argued, what happens in a depression is that investors' expectations of future profits get crushed. Who opens a new factory in the middle of a recession? And once those expectations get embedded amongst investors as a class, it becomes irrational to invest. G, the government, has to spend money, not to pay off clients or bribe the voters, but to alter the price signals to which investors respond, making it rational for them to invest again. This is why government spending is central to Keynes' view of the world. But once again, there is a politics to this, a politics that Keynes himself denied, and that is what effectively became the bug that crashes version 2.0. If in the first equation, it's the individual capitalist and the investor who is the hero, investing and bringing things to the market, Q, Then in the software for version 2.0, it is government spending G, which drives and regulates the level of private sector investment I. In version 2.0, it's government spending, not the animal spirits of the private sector, that is key to stabilizing demand and ending recessions. Given this, if you want to avoid fascism, communism, and put markets and democracy together productively, government spending to maintain consumption to avoid recessions and depressions is critical. It's a feature, not a bug. Successfully targeting spending by running budget deficits when needed becomes the key software role, with full employment, high wages, constant productivity improvements, and a high level of redistribution through taxes becoming possible in version 2.0 for the first time. This was the software that produced the post-war welfare state and the post-war growth story. The desire to permanently quell the anger that the crash of version 1.0 created drove the development of new software and a full hardware reconfiguration to boot. With the very real fact of communism in Berlin in 1945 focusing the minds of policy elites in the West, and the combination of depression and war breaking the old hardware, the advent of this new software for running the machine created the room for a massive reboot of the system. That reboot was hugely successful. For the first time right across developed countries, the top of the income distribution in every country came down. The bottom went up, and the whole distribution moved up together for nearly 30 years. This was the period when French national income tripled. The Italians talked about il boom, the Americans discovered the middle class, and British conservative politicians built millions of units of public housing and boasted that the working class had never had it so good. Indeed, they had not.
It's important to stress how different the new system was. Regardless of national hardware variations and local software modifications, one policy target, full employment, was the common goal of all nations. This had never happened before. But since the 1920s and 1930s had shown that unemployment and poverty made people angry to the point that the system will collapse, the new system reset was designed to make sure that didn't happen again. But to sustain full employment and high real wages, the hardware of version 2.0 had to be fundamentally rebuilt too. First, finance had to be put in a box and locked away. Finance that built factories and invested in technology was fine. Finance that sought to short currencies, speculate on bonds was banned. Banks were kept in restrictive silos that limited what they could do, in the US and in the UK, or they were legally mandated to be heavily capitalized, thereby limiting their leverage in continental Europe. Labour was legally recognized as not being a commodity just like...
All right, I know I'm letting them talk quite a bit, you know what I'm saying? But it's important that we understand the history behind where we are right now. Right, and they're telling, you know what I'm saying, a good story. But it's also, I want to state the fact that legitimately, like, you know, immigration as a whole, you know what I'm saying, was shut down during this time too. This was a highly nationalized, popularized, you know what I mean, type of situation from 1948 to 1970. Right, it's very important to understand what this was, all right, as a whole, and to understand what the 60s reforms were really actually about. And it had nothing to do with civil rights or treating anybody better or anything of this nature. It had way more to do with the fact that, you know, businesses really needed new workers and needed an expanded workforce because, well, you know, running full employment ends up with inflation because inflation actually comes from wages. A lot of people don't understand it. Like, demand is not something that's a constant. Demand is something that is driven by the fact that individuals have the ability to buy things. That's a highly important fact to understand, you know, and Keynes understood this. And I'll be honest, most people still think that inflation comes from, you know what I mean, printing money out with, you know what I mean, nothing behind it. That's not true because of the fact that, like, you're not going to have, you can imprint the money into oblivion. If nobody is able to get their hands on it, it doesn't matter. Is kind of the deal. And that's really where this is at. If they gave everybody $1 million, it's a different situation. But if they just print money like it's going out of style, it doesn't really matter as a whole.
Like any other. And collective bargaining between unions and employers became the norm. This gave both sides political leverage, which meant that productivity gains were more evenly split between capital and labour. This in turn meant that if capital wanted to increase profits and full employment was the target, they would have to increase productivity to do so, which stimulated further investment. This produced a virtuous circle where high productivity created high wages, which meant high consumption and high tax revenues, all of which enabled the production of high-quality public goods, healthcare, education, housing, that lowered labour's dependence on the market still further and took the anger out of the system. And all of this was buttressed by a set of international monetary institutions and agreements that kept exchange rates stable and capital local. This was a radical and deep-seated hardware reconfiguration and software reboot that enabled countries as different as the United States and Sweden to sustain full employment as the policy target for 3 decades, until the wheels rather unexpectedly fell off the wagon. Because just as there was a bug in the software of version 1.0, treating labour as a commodity while denying the possibility of involuntary unemployment, so there was a bug in this system too. Which brings us to Mikhail, the third economist in our opening parable. You know all about this guy, Mark, so over to you.
In 1943, in the midst of the war, and with the revolution in economic ideas about full employment in full swing, the Polish economist Mikhail Kalecki wrote 7 pages of text for the journal Political Quarterly that not only identified the bug in the software of version 2.0, but predicted what version 3.0, the world we grew up in, would look like. It's an amazing piece to read, even today. Kalecki argued that Keynes missed the politics of sustaining full employment over the long run. Far from being welcomed by the investor class, sustained full employment would consistently push up wages and kill the returns to investment. Put simply, if the labour market is consistently tight, then the dumbest people in your firm can leave work at noon and get a new job at a higher wage by 4 p.m. While this would clearly benefit labour, it would lead to capital thinking that this new state-led labour-friendly version of capitalism was, at the end of the day, a really bad deal. First, given strong labour unions and costless mobility from job to job, management's right to manage would be undermined, and labour indiscipline, especially strikes, would spike. This is exactly what happened in the 1970s across the rich countries of the world. Second, the only way that firms could hold on to skilled workers given such pressures would be to pay them even more in wages. But the only way that firms could absorb these costs would be to raise prices ahead of productivity. But if all firms respond in this way, it ignites a wages-chasing prices-chasing wages spiral of inflation that in turn provokes more strikes as workers realise that the wage increase they just secured is eaten away by inflation. It would also be the end of high wages forcing firms to be more productive. This is also exactly what happened in the 1970s. Crucially, an unanticipated acceleration of inflation acts as a tax on the returns to investment that, as Keynes realised, retards future investment. Basically, if I'm an investor and I expect to make a return of 5% real over 5 years, net of inflation, on an investment in an environment of 3% inflation, I need to make an 8% return. But if inflation unexpectedly accelerates over that 5-year period to, say, 10%, and my costs rise in line with inflation, my returns are destroyed. Given this, Kalecki predicted that under a policy of sustained full employment, investment would fall and inflation would continue to rise, even as labour markets were tight. Once again, he was exactly correct. Think about this for a moment. Kalecki had predicted in 1943 stagflation, the simultaneous combination of unemployment and inflation in the 1970s.
All right, so the reason why life was so good back in the 1950s was twofold, well, threefold, right? Number one, the rest of the world was bombed out and America was making everything and the world was, rebuilding, and so we were selling them all them goods. Secondly, it was the fact that they were chasing full employment, so therefore everybody's wages constantly went up in an inflationary cycle. Number three, there was little to no goddamn immigration into America at that point, right? And this is important to understand, that there's reasons why things happened as they did. And due to the fact that the United States dollar was backed by gold at that point, whether or not everybody wants to admit it or not, under the Bretton Woods Agreement, America had to maintain a certain level. Your dollars always had the power to be able to be saved. Today, that's changed completely. Let's keep going.
70s. The inevitability of a system of closed economies driving consumption and targeting full employment had to produce an inflationary crisis for investors. This was the bug buried deep within the software of capitalism version 2.0. Kalecki even predicted the beginnings of the reboot to version 3.0 that started in the late 1970s and which was completed 2 decades later. He said, and it's worth quoting him here, that because of this crisis of profitability, a powerful bloc is likely to be formed between big business and the rentier financial interests, and they would probably find more than one economist to declare that the situation was manifestly unsound. The pressure of all these forces, and in particular of big business, would most probably induce the government to return to the orthodox policy of cutting down the budget deficit. Kalecki, 1943, page 330. Yes, he had just predicted Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, the liberation of finance, and the beginnings of capitalism 3.0.
So, if the problem with capitalism version 2.0 was a wage price spiral damaging investment and ultimately scoring an own goal against the objective of full employment, then version 3.0 was specifically designed to restore the power of capital, deregulate markets, and destroy inflation. Now, it's actually quite easy to kill inflation if you are willing to deal with the political fallout. You simply push up interest rates, as Fed Chairman Paul Volcker did in 1980 by rationing bank reserves. Doing so makes borrowing and debt expensive, and as a result, businesses fail, demand falls, unemployment rises, and a deep recession squeezes labour and pushes inflation down, which is what both Reagan and Thatcher did in the early 1980s. But to keep it down and ride that political storm, you needed to fundamentally change the software and reconfigure the hardware once again. The new software that was written for version 3.0 was the revolution that had taken place in macroeconomic theory during this disruptive period. Tell us about that.
These are the ideas that we were raised on in our classes at university in the 1980s and 1990s. The lesson learned was that the software running capitalism version 2.0 could not generate stable inflation and low unemployment at the same time. This, plus a turn in economics to more microeconomic approaches, provided the political representatives of capital, Kalecki's powerful bloc, with their new software. We call this set of ideas neoliberalism. But to run this new software, you had to do more than simply tweak the old hardware. You had to fundamentally reconfigure it once again. The new policy target for version 3.0 was not full employment, for that produced inflation, but price stability, that is guarding against inflation at all costs. Although raising interest rates will crush inflation in the short term, to make this permanent, hardware changes were needed that would destroy the ability of the system to generate inflation in the first place. There were 4 key hardware changes that took place in the 1980s, which took inflation out of the system permanently, restored the value of capital, and in doing so built the world that we grew up in. The first was to destroy the power of organised labour to raise wages. Whether it was done through outright confrontations with organised labour, epitomised by Thatcher's bitter battle with the British National Union of Miners in the 1980s, or through the migration of business to right-to-work union-free states in the US in the 1970s, or through EU-level policies for greater flexibility in the 1990s, union membership everywhere plummeted. And along with it, so did Labour's ability to capture the gains from productivity increases. This in turn shows up in how much income Labour takes home from GDP growth. It has fallen dramatically. Given this, the ability of wages to rise ahead of productivity falls drastically. But what really accelerates these trends are 2 other hardware reconfigurations, the opening up of financial markets and the globalization of production. A key hardware modification of version 2.0 was the insulation of the economy from financial flows. Basically, if you wanted to increase investment at home, you had to stop it going abroad. That meant banks were restricted in what they could do, as we've already noted. But in lifting those restrictions, a process that began in the late 1970s and was completed more or less by the late 1980s, capital was free to find its highest return, wherever that may be. Add to this the technological changes that made the globalization of production possible, such as the invention of the container ship, the IT revolution, and the rise of multi-platform production and offshoring, and Labour's ability to demand real wage gains is further disabled.
Version 3.0 was then predicated on allowing capital to be free to find its highest return. But doing so has costs. Huge flows of capital and rapid reversals caused a series of increasingly severe booms and busts across the developing world, culminating in the Asian and Russian crisis in 1997 to 1998. The developed world proved similarly vulnerable during the euro crisis. Northern savings flooded southern markets after the creation of the euro in 1999, looking for higher returns. As post-crisis fears over the stability of southern European banks and governments built, these flows reversed, exacerbating the pain.
Correct. One of the main arguments for version 3.0 was that capital would be more efficiently allocated, and at one level it was. But what that means in real terms is that investment leaves capital-rich countries and ends up in capital-poor countries, such as China. Western firms benefit from this, as do their shareholders. Consumers in Western countries benefit from cheaper goods, but the investment that would have happened in their country now happens elsewhere, which is a cost. This is why trade is now such a contentious issue.
Finally, locking this in was the biggest hardware modification of all in capitalism version 3.0, the rise of so-called independent central banks. Remember the quantity theory equation where the state controls M and raising M caused inflation. Logically then, once you've disabled Labour's ability to generate inflation, the only other possible source of inflation is the state, since that prints the money, M. And with the rise of global financial markets that can punish states for policies that they don't like by taking their money out of the country, devaluing the currency and causing a crisis, the case for giving authority over monetary policy to an independent agency, which took the long view rather than allowing politicians that always took the short-term view to make policy, became compelling. And so, over the course of the 1990s, this hardware modification spread across almost all the machines running the software for version 3.0 as central bank independence. And the rise of the central banker as the most powerful policymaker in the land spread across the OECD and beyond. The result was a system that once again similar across those countries that produced common outputs, but those outputs were the complete opposite of version 2.0.
But as you stressed in the previous dialogue, Eric, one of the reasons version 3.0 lasted as long, if not longer, than version 2.0 was the fact that it worked. It restored the value of capital and crushed inflation. But in doing so, it set the system up for not one, but three bugs that would crush the system in 2008. The first bug was inequality in income and wealth. One of the signature claims for the boosters of version 3.0, as it was for version 1.0, was that while the new system was geared towards capital rather than labour, the resulting growth would raise all boats, or at least trickle down to everyone else. However, the problem we discovered by about 1995 through the work of economists such as Tony Atkinson, Martin Wolf, Thomas Piketty and Branko Milanovic was that it was all trickling up, not down. The numbers are well known, and we've mentioned some already, but just to recap, remember the following. While globalisation certainly benefited workers in the developing world, workers in the bottom 50% of the global income distribution captured only 12% of total growth. Meanwhile, the top 1% of the global income distribution made off with 27% of total growth. While some countries have held the line more than others.
Well, I'll tell you what. I put this graph up for everybody to understand exactly what he's talking about, because it's kind of important as a whole, right? You know, like, it's important for us to understand that, the entire share of, you know what I'm saying? Hang on, I'm grabbing this other graph for y'all real quick, because it's important to understand, like, exactly what's going on, right? Hang on, we're going to save this. Right. Elephant. Right, we're going to save this real quick. But anyway, right, so this here is kind of important to understand as well, right? You know, I know, like, my computer's like, oh my God, you're going to melt down and blah, 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 right? It's important to, like, stand here and understand exactly what they're talking about. And I'm going to put this graph up for you that they're talking about real quick, right? Because this here is what's known as the elephant graph, right? So, all right, how to explain this? Okay, so the big lump in the middle, right, from, from the left to the right, the big lump in the middle is China, basically. That's how much wealth they've gained since the beginning of neoliberalism, right? That spot down on the very, very bottom, that is the middle class of Europe and America, right? And then the trunk, which is the top of it, right? That's the top 1% as a whole, and their share of what they got in the wealth of the last 30 years. This is important, right? Like, literally, we got none, right? China got a big chunk of it, and China, India, places like this, Pakistan, wherever, Vietnam, Korea, right? And then the trunk is, like, at a top 1% share, right? Because they got about 27% of all the wealth, right? And this is exactly what these guys are talking about as a whole. I wanted to show that to you because I thought it was kind of important.
Almost every country has become more unequal over time, especially in countries such as the US that had relatively high income inequality to start with. But inequality is only a bug if another bug shows up, which it did in due course. That bug is wage stagnation, which is what happens when labour's ability to take their share of growth is politically hamstrung by a combination of globalisation, technological change, and the assault on unions. Now, I know you have some qualms about this regarding the measurement of inflation, but the key point is relative. If wages are rising for the bottom 60% of a country's workers, then it matters much less that the top 10% or above are making even more. Growth, like poverty, is relative. But version 3.0 not only generated inequality, it generated relative wage stagnation for the majority of workers in the developed world, and in some cases real income losses, especially in the last 10 years of the regime. Again, for illustration, according to many accounts using US data, the bottom 60% of US workers have not had a real wage increase, money wages less inflation, since 1979. And while measurement of inflation and other factors complicate this picture, as you said earlier, Eric, what is indisputable is that dispersal across the wage distribution has increased too. Here's a fact that illustrates that brutally. Wall Street bonuses in 2015, when the economy was still healing from the crash of 2008, totaled $28.5 billion. That's twice the total wages paid to every person in a minimum wage job in the US that year, which is around 3 million workers. In sum, capitalism version 3.0 had 3 bugs. The first bug was trickle-up inequality. The second was wage stagnation and massive dispersal across the wage distribution. The third was a response to both of these factors that ended up compounding them, one of which you're most familiar with, leverage in the banking system. Why don't you talk about that?
Okay, I will. Banks are funny things.
All right, let me address that real quick, right? Because I think it is important. And here's the weird thing. The whole way through this book, they never address housing prices, right? Which isn't taken into account in inflation as a whole, right? When they're talking about inflation, like, I don't... For homeowners, yes, your house is an asset. So when it goes up in value, you end up going up in value. But it's for individuals who... And for instance, the young individuals who are standing here starting off in life, being able to buy a home or being able to rent an apartment is highly important. And when the cost of that is continually rising, that makes life extremely difficult for individuals to be able to survive as a whole. So, I'd like to be able to address that fact as far as, like, what I'm saying, whether or not, like, we've had any real inflation, right? Because I think we have. But I don't think it's inflation. And this is what I'm saying about inflation is driven by wages. It's not driven by money, right? So when you're talking about more and more individuals being poured into this country as a whole, immigrants and all the other things, it drives up the cost because, supply and demand. It's a basic premise. And when you have more demand for real estate than you have real estate, especially in metropolitan areas where there's jobs, you're going to end up having, less wages because of the fact that you have more people there and higher, prices for housing. And it's not inflation, but it's, like small bubbles and assets that will end up affecting it. That and commodities, it's twice the price of wood, just this year so far. But all right, let's keep rocking.
Even at the level of language, what the bank thinks of as an asset, we think of as a liability. A car loan, a mortgage, a student loan. A bank has no interest in owning your house. It wants the income stream that the loan to buy the house generates. So assets and liabilities together sum to zero. Similarly, one person's interest payment is another person's income, and that sums to zero too. This is why economists sort of forgot about finance being a problem. If it all sums to zero, who cares? Why we should have cared is nicely illustrated by Citibank's 2003 to 2005 advertising campaign, which ran billboards across America with the tagline, "Open a cravings account, live richly." If my wages are not growing and all the wealth the economy generates is going to capital and not labor, how can one live richly? The clue is that Citibank is a bank, and your liabilities are their assets. In short, you borrow massively. When Fed Chairman Volcker increased interest rates in the early 1980s, at the same time that finance was being liberalized, it ushered in a period where real interest rates, the nominal rate minus inflation, stayed high, while inflation fell fast. The result was that finance suddenly became fantastically profitable, and finance makes its profits by providing credit. So if you expect capitalism version 3.0 to keep you in your job and maintain your standard of living, you can borrow more against your future income. And even if your wages are not rising, with interest rates gradually falling as they did by the 1990s from the very high real rates of the 1980s, you can still keep borrowing more. And borrow we did, with the US and EU consumer credit almost doubling relative to disposable income from the 1980s to the mid-2000s. But if interest rates are falling and the banks are making their money through loans, how can they still make money? The answer is simple: make even more loans, with the end result that the system as a whole becomes very highly leveraged. And in pursuit of ever higher profits, banks themselves borrowed more to lend more, with the result that the bank's equities fell to a fraction of their assets, mainly mortgages, often by a factor of 30 to 1.
All right, this here is debt to GDP, right? And you notice that in 1940, it was rising. It went down in 1950 a little bit, in the 1950s some, and then it went back up in the 1960s, and then it just went exponentially up, right, up until the 2008 crash, and then went back down. It's only measures, I think, up until like 2012, 2013, something like that. It makes life kind of difficult when you're trying to stand here and, really, look for graphs and things to show what's going on, right? Because, it's, whatever, right? But I'm throwing this together kind of as I go, right? But this is U.S. debt, and basically, you know what I'm saying? Let's overlay this with, you know what I'm saying, the graph of, you know what I mean? Hang on a minute, we'll shut this down, right? Here's 1948, you know what I'm saying? This is the productivity gain. Here goes, you know what I'm saying, the red line is the wages, right? And so how did we take up for that productivity gain? Like, we just ended up standing here borrowing money. Like, it's that simple, you know what I mean? United States citizens just went into debt to continue to pay their bills and live the way, you know what I mean, they had been accustomed to living as far as things are really concerned. You know what I mean? And that's important to understand. It's all kind of part of the puzzle as a whole, right? Let's keep rocking now.
How can they still make money? The answer is simple. Make even more loans, with the end result that the system as a whole becomes very highly leveraged. And in pursuit of ever higher profits, banks themselves borrowed more to lend more, with the result that the bank's equities fell to a fraction of their assets, mainly mortgages, often by a factor of 30 to 1. Given this, when a bunch of mortgage companies and mortgage bond funds started failing in 2007, it didn't take long for it to develop into a full-blown crisis. The losses in these markets ate through the bank's relatively small equity base, rendering them insolvent. The system as a whole had a heart attack, called a credit crunch. In short, capitalism version 3.0's combination of rising inequality and stagnant wages could be made to work so long as inflation was low, yes. Interest rates were initially high but fell over time, encouraging further borrowing, yes. And the ability to borrow was unlimited. When the system crashed in 2008, it exposed just how much leverage there was in the banks. It exposed how polarized in terms of income and wealth countries had become, and how this whole system rested on finance constantly churning loans from one part of society to another, and from one country, as in the case of the Eurozone, to another. And it all rested once again on Polanyi's critical fiction that labour was a commodity just like any other, and that people don't get angry when they figure out they are being treated as a commodity. Unfortunately, it seems that they do.
In fairness, given a shock of this magnitude, and given how interconnected and leveraged the global system of banks had become, the politicians in charge of capitalism version 3.0 had a tough choice to make. Version 1.0 crashed in the 1920s and staggered on until the 1930s, when it finally fell apart with disastrous results. Version 2.0's crash provoked a lot of anger too, but the reboot was thorough, and it seemed stable until the inflationary bug began to play havoc. The problem with version 3.0's crash was that the world had become so financially interdependent and globalized that it was feared that the system as a whole might go down like in the 1930s. So rather than allow it to fail, we turned to the central bankers, the new guardians of the system, and told them to bail the whole thing out. Central bankers are a bit misunderstood. Even if they are independent, they ultimately take their orders from governments. And when a global banking system reliant on borrowing and lending in dollars blew up, the US Federal Reserve stepped in and gave almost any bank, anywhere, who needed it, access to US dollars to keep them afloat, almost regardless of country of origin. Eventually the Fed, the Bank of England, and the Bank...
Okay, so I wanted to check in a little bit of this real quick, right? So I hate to say this, but I'll be honest with you, man. That whole entire housing crisis thing, I think, was a complete and utter horseshit way of explaining this, right? Because, like, you know, let's be real here, you know, like, in case you ain't seeing that last huge spike, that happened directly as the housing bubble popped. What happened, you know, people couldn't afford basic transportation debts. You know what I mean? Like, trucks didn't run. Like, freight prices went up. Shipping costs went up. Like, when these things happen and you end up with $147 a barrel oil, you know what I mean? Like, that, you know what I mean? That kind of screws up the economy as a whole, right? And the same thing happened back in the 1980s. And again, that happened, you know, 1970s, you know what I mean, with inflation and with, you know, with the oil embargo, you know what I mean? And what happened, what really caused, you know what I mean, inflation as far as things are concerned. So understand something, like, you know, the dollar as a value across the world is highly important to understand that when you devalue the currency, you do devalue the currency in oil, right? It's highly important to understand that. And oil is the lifeblood of the world, you know what I mean? And to say, like, you know what I mean, America is energy independent, blah, blah, blah. The problem is, you know what I mean, is that, you know, our politicians don't know that. And, you know what I mean, the equity or the markets that stand here, the futures markets, don't treat it as such. And that's important to understand. You know what I'm saying? It's not a separate market for just U.S. oil. You know what I mean? Like, U.S. oil is on a global stage and whatnot, you know, so it's all kind of tied together. So, like, let's keep rocking.
Bank of Japan, and even the European Central Bank, eventually, bailed out the system to the tune of around $17 trillion. And while such action saved the system, it was too late to avoid a global recession, the near bankrupting of Europe, and as a result of a series of major policy errors, unemployment in parts of Europe reaching levels and for durations not seen since the 1930s. Also, after the initial panic had been contained, it led to the tightening of government budgets around the world, so-called austerity policies, which made matters worse. But what also mattered in producing Angrynomics this time around was that it was ordinary taxpayers who were paying the brunt of these costs through unemployment, reduced consumption, bankruptcy, and through the micro-stressors that these generated, from drug-fueled deaths of despair to increasing suicides. Taxpayers who in many instances were already heavily indebted and had seen their own income stagnate for years. They saw some of the richest members of their societies being bailed out as they were flung out of work. Labour was once again a commodity. Capital was protected, epitomised by the US insurance company AIG paying out hundreds of millions in bonuses in 2009 after being bailed out by the taxpayer to the tune of $180 billion. The bottom 80% were effectively paying for the mistakes of the top 1%, while in the process bailing out the assets and incomes of the top 20%, right across the world. It was, as I described it at the time, the greatest bait and switch in human history, as the private sector liabilities of the banking system ended up being put on the public balance sheet of states as more public debt, which was then blamed by the political classes that had allowed all this to happen, on a crisis of overspending by states that simply didn't happen in the first place.
Well, it absolutely did happen. You know what I'm saying? We've been talking about the pension crisis forever, right? I mean, like, that's something that, is like undeniable, like legitimately, you know what I'm saying? Like it's something that like people don't want to have any conversation about as a whole, right? Like it's insane. You know what I mean? Like, it's ridiculous the amount of money, you know what I mean, that people like that they've stood here and promised individuals that they can't fucking provide. You know what I mean? Like that's highly important to understand, And so like here's another graph, you know what I'm saying? Like, we'll stand here and keep putting these up, you know what I mean? So that everybody can understand exactly what's popping off as a whole, right? Because like, there's a lot of places where, they're legitimately not funding, the pensions in general, right? So this here is a graph of all the places, you know what I'm saying, that, like how much money is like actually paid. This is as of 2018, right? Like these are, each individual state, right? You can go through, I'm saying, all the ones in blue are below, 60% funding for their pensions and whatnot, right? PA, Illinois, Kentucky, Jersey, Boston, or Jersey, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, I forget what Connecticut, Vermont, Minnesota, Colorado, Mississippi, South Carolina, right? All these places are below 60% of their pensions being funded. And that's because of the fact that they, stood here and made promises that they couldn't keep in the future. Get nothing misunderstood about that. That's kind of highly important to really look at when it comes down to it. And let's be honest here. You know what I'm saying? Let's stand here and let's look at something else as well. Right. There's another big chunk of this that people don't want to stand here and have a conversation about. You know what I mean? Like, hang on a minute. Let's look at this. Hang on a minute. Yeah. Right. Like, it's highly important to understand the amount of money, right? That's, legitimately, inside of the market as a whole. Right. Like the amount of 401ks and pensions that are completely relying upon the market, is the reason why they keep bailing out this fucking system, because the baby boomers are counting on this, and there's no way. Like, and when a lot of these, here's the real bitch, a lot of these are actually standing here, what's the word? A lot of these are standing here and they're backed by the FDIC, right? So in the end of the day, right, it's important to understand that, if these individuals lose their goddamn money, you know what I'm saying, the government has to bail it out anyway. You know what I mean? When it really comes down to it, like that's kind of where things really are. You know what I mean? So in the end of the day, you know what I'm saying? Like it's important for us to really, have that conversation and know that the reasons why they're standing here bailing out the system as a whole. I'm gonna tell you what, I'm gonna save that motherfucker right there. Yo, but yeah, all right, man. Look, let's keep going with this. Let's keep going with this thing.
Not many people know the intricacies of the banking sector, but they do know when they're being ripped off. Whether it was the Tea Party movement in the US, outraged at capitalism for the people and socialism for the banks, Los Indignados in Spain protesting austerity cuts, or in the UK with Brexit, the crisis provoked a politics of anger that is now transforming politics everywhere. And if we think in terms of the three bugs that together brought down version 3.0, wage stagnation, bank leverage and inequality, we can see that these bugs in the system still remain. Despite a return to full employment in many economies, wage growth has been relatively weak for the majority of workers. The banking sectors of the developed countries are now more concentrated, they have even fewer players, and are as profitable, if not more so, than a decade ago. Meanwhile, inequality remains stark, all of which continues to produce a huge amount of tension in the system, what systems engineers call constrained volatility, that increases over time. And that volatility constraint has to blow up at some point.
So why hasn't the system crashed again? Some of the bugs in the software have been fixed. The banking system, on most standard measures of risk, is much, much stronger. Also, policymakers were completely terrified by the financial crisis, which makes them highly alert to repeating the same mistakes. These factors alone may explain the extremely stable rate of global growth. But there's still a problem, I feel, and it's to do with moral anger. The injustices writ large by the crisis and the reassessment of 30 years of deregulation cannot be assuaged by continuing with the status quo. Capitalism version 3.0 got bailed out without a reset. The consequences of neither rebooting the system nor doing anything to remove the bugs in its software has produced another deep bout of anger. That anger is bubbling up slowly, building momentum, and it is systemic, deep-rooted, and it is here to stay. Populism is the result of not resetting the system after a crash. Whether it's the anger that gives us polarization in US politics, populism in German politics, or Brexit in British politics, the system should have been reset, and it wasn't. By failing to make fundamental changes to a system that has become a stress generator for the majority of those populations, we have created the conditions for another round of transformative Angrynomics. We should not be surprised by this. As we have discussed in this dialogue, macro-systemic crashes always produce public anger. That anger can be righteous indignation that can be addressed, or a tribal energy that can be weaponized. We're in the midst of one such moment. But that is only the half of it. The other half is the micro side of Angrynomics.
Dialogue.
All right. Well, you know what I'm saying? That was chapter 3. I wanted to bring that to y'all. You know what I'm saying? See what y'all think. You know what I mean? Legit, I think y'all should read this book. It's called Angrynomics by Eric Longerton and Mark Blythe. It's a great book. Has a lot of good history in it, a lot of good information in it. And to be honest with you, you know what I'm saying? Like I have a graph I haven't used yet because it's kind of important, right? Like, yo, so let's look at this here real quick before we go on. All right, let's stand here and put these two graphs up. I think it's important for us to sit here and, you know, I mean, really have this conversation as a whole, right? You know, I mean, let's do that, right? We'll go like this, and then we're gonna stand here. We're gonna go like this, right? See, here's your productivity. Right, productivity came from, you know, I mean, bringing in mass amounts of immigrants and paying them next to nothing, and there's gap. Excuse me, right, and there's the gap. You know what I'm saying, in between your wages and what the wages should be, as a whole. Right, I wanted to put that down, and I wanted to stand here and say this. You know what I mean, because like, you know, there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in this book. There are a lot of pro-immigrant sentiment in this book. But the truth of the matter is when you stand here and they go, oh, well, you know, this, like there's one guy, Eric, he says, you know, well, you know, I mean, these towns are being held together by these, you know, I mean, low wage immigrants and stuff. And I go, well, yeah, they might be, but that doesn't mean that like the average worker isn't still earning shit. And that's the problem, right? In the end of the day, you know what I'm saying? Like they're not making the gains that their parents did or that their grandparents did. And so therefore, you're having this feeling and having these individuals looking at you like, why aren't you doing better? Why aren't you doing better than I did? And that's an important thing to understand. So in the end of the day, I'm Tom Peace. This is Pnoid News. Y'all know the deal. Peace be like one. Later.